Greetings and welcome back to St. Dominic's Weekly. This is Father Isaiah, that's Father Michael.
And we are smack dab in the continuation of our C.S. Lewis. At this point, I'm just calling it an extravaganza.
As well. Extravaganza, yes. Part 3 of Screwtape Letters. So,
yep, our summer series continues here, where we do a deep dive into the different letters of the very famous work of C.S. Lewis, where you have this mid-level bureaucratic devil, Screwtape, giving advice to his quote-unquote nephew, Wormwood, on how to tempt the patient. And we're getting halfway. We'll be halfway through at the end of this podcast. So we have, in a sense, about after today, halfway through, and each chapter that we're doing, we are highlighting the chapter with a word or a phrase, which is a strategy of the devil, a strategy of Satan, whereby we might be led down the wrong path, and then we're reflecting on perhaps how we can kind of reverse that or invert that, such that we see how do we grow in virtue in that way. So just quick recap. This is ultra 2-minute recap. Can we do it? It's like did you ever grow up with like highlights of like football or baseball?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So there used to be. Oh gosh, I'm getting to it.
And then there's that kind of countdown.
Yeah. On the ESPN channel, because when growing up we didn't have ESPN, but I remember we go over to grandpa's house on Sunday. They did. They had it, and there was a highlight show in which they would show all of the highlights in a very rapid manner. It's like if you haven't seen any football today, you could just watch for the next half an hour and you'd see literally all the important parts of every game. Now they have, even for football, they'll do if you...
now they have Red Zone.
Red Zone, yeah, exactly. Yeah. You knew where I was thinking, where they show, and they literally take, I think, like 5 minutes and show every scoring play or every touchdown.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's like, all in a row, right? Yeah. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to do Red Zone recap of C.S. Lewis. One word phrase. So, Chapter 1, we've got distractions, right? Especially from thinking. We've got, then in Chapter 2, we've got discouragement, right? Number 3, we've got weaponizing family. Then we have basically emotionalizing prayer in Chapter 4. Chapter 5 is the two-edged sword of suffering, getting into despair. Then fear, paralyzing fear in Chapter 6. Chapter 7 is that I was calling extremism, either in terms of belief in the devil or political movement kinds of things. Then we've got chapters 8 and 9, which form a kind of a unit in which you weaponize pleasure by taking low points in someone's life or dry spells and really trying to overstimulate them. And that's chapter 8 and 9 together. And then chapter 10, weaponizing friendship or keeping this friendship superficial. And then finally, weaponizing humor, giving the humor a sense in which it's biting or flippant, indifferent or degrading in some way. And we did that, and that was the fastest thing of doing that. So far so good. We now embark on chapter 12, and since we're doing the one word summaries or one phrase summaries, give me your phrase or your word for chapter 12.
I got 2 words, in fact.
Ooh, 2 words. Let's hear them.
2 words for chapter 12, letter 12.
Well, with drum roll.
The gentle slope.
The gentle slope. Doesn't sound like much like, tell me, how's that a temptation, the gentle slope?
Well, it's surprising in the matter of speaking, where the best way to kind of summarize is what Screwtape actually says towards the end of the letter, where he says, murder is no better than cards if cards can do the trick. So so that's in the last paragraph of the letter, of the very fact that it doesn't necessarily have to be the one gigantic moral sin that'll bring a patient to our Father's house below, but rather just that slow habituation of deeds, little deeds over time that allows the patient to be comfortable and to be under the temptation of his of wormwood.
Yeah, are you saying that the road to hell is paved with poker?
Yes.
Okay. No, I thought that was that line really stood out. Basically, murder is no better if cards will do the trick. So you use poker. Once again, he does talk about pastimes being good. So, or at least Screwtape says, don't let him get involved with pastimes. So it's not necessarily poker per se, but any kind of small erosion of doing good doing not you're doing something bad. You're just not doing everything you could.
Yeah. They're not doing the great.
The phrase that came to mind when I read this chapter was "frog in the water."
Okay. Yeah.
Sure. And so this is the old. I don't even. Did they really do?
I have no idea if they actually did that experiment or not.
Yeah, you hear that all the time. That there's high school lab projects are if you want to boil a frog, you put him in hot water, it'll jump out immediately. But you put a frog into lukewarm water or coldish water, and then you
slowly
crank up the temperature, and the frog won't jump out. I'm sure someone's done it at some point.
Yeah, but I've never had a inkling for frog legs.
Well, I don't know who's doing. I mean, maybe I don't know if that's a ubiquitous sort of experiment, but certainly it's out there as an image, and take it to be true. But it is true, because in our own lives, how easily we follow the gentle slope towards our own kind of things that we know we shouldn't do, but we just find ourselves there. As he says, just right before you were quoting, it says, it does not matter, and this is Screwtape talking to Wormwood, it does not matter how small the sins are, right? Or even the sins of we think of omission and just not doing what you have to do, provided the cumulative effect is the edge the person away from the light and out into the nothing. It's like, ooh, it's like, wow. So there's an interesting thing too in terms of that's that gentle slope that we can all relate to as it comes with, and this is you mentioned, I think in the last podcast about Inception.
Right. Yeah.
that movie where Screwtape says to Wormwood, if you introduce a temptation that's going to seem foreign to him, he's going to reject it. So if you're like, oh, you kind of tempt him to be angry with that person, it's like, oh, you ought to kill that person. Well, you're not going to kill him. I mean, no one's going to commit murder on a certain kind of whim, unless it's there's available means or something like that. But it's not going to be a maliciously intended thing for most
right. It's not going to be
people.
A natural.
It's not going to be a natural response. So, but you can affect the same thing if you tempt the person not to murder the other person, but the next time that person you talk about that person to someone else, you kind of dig them a little bit. You kind of begin to it destroys reputation, right? You begin to marginalize them in how you
gossip about him. You
gossip
these little things over and over again.
That's right. You're passive aggressive to him when it comes to interacting. You kind of nudge him out, and slowly but surely, as Jesus says, he who even if you don't kill someone, right? He who has murder in his heart, in a sense, has effectively done the same thing. And from the devil's perspective, the devil doesn't care how we sin, and doesn't care even how big we sin, just that
we actually do.
We slowly, slowly be able to let as Screwtape as that noxious fog, or that asphyxiating fog, dissipate in our life. That is, he's talking about noxious fog is God's grace, right? In that way. And so very small sins ultimately are the pavement to hell. He says, if he does warn him, he says, when you might be daunted by the fact that you feel like you're not doing anything because he's just cutting corners here and there, right? He's just basically, not doing everything he can. And doubtless, you might want to be like young tempters. You are anxious to report something spectacular. I got someone to do one of the 7 deadly sins in a spectacular way. Right. He says, don't do that. That's not what it is. So basically, it's the gentle slope. And that's certainly a cautionary. That's how sin works.
Yeah.
Slowly but first, slowly but surely. And so we just have to, which is in some ways heartening in the sense that it means that if the road downwards is a gentle slope, it follows, or you can infer maybe that
the road up is just as gentle as slope. Yeah.
Exactly. And so it's just by saying, I think I mentioned a couple podcasts ago how someone gave me advice about saying no to what you want to do. You'll never regret that, because if you say no, you can always maybe go back to it. But once you say yes and you give in to something that you know is selfish, then there's always a sense in which that can spiral into guilt and shame and all the rest, where that, even as difficult as that no is, that slowly, gradually leads up. And so the sense of just being sacrificial. I mean, it really comes down to making sacrifices. That is, to not let your will be totally driving the boat on everything I want to do.
Right.
And slowly, you kind of do that. And you get that. I know parents that you talk about, especially the children. That there's one little exercise that I know. It was my brother was telling me about, and I got to witness, where he asked, asked on a daily basis, what sacrifice did you make at the end of the day?
Ooh.
Right?
Yeah.
And
Ooh.
I like that.
Yeah.
Because it makes you think like, oh, how did I act selflessly today for someone else? And if I have to think about it too long,
that should tell you something.
It should tell you something in and of itself, right? But even the kinds of things we say let us know how far or how swiftly that we're walking up that gentle slope towards eternal reward. So the gentle slope of 12. That's a chapter to go back to again and again for sure. A letter to go back to, which leads us to chapter 13, which is a real turning point in terms of the plot, because it is from the perspective of Wormwood. A tough chapter, because the patient has made progress. He was at a low. He had been tempted with pleasures. He had weaponized his friendship. He was his faith was hitting dry spots, and basically had what's the kind of the gradual descent. The man, if the man would have died in chapter 12, he was not destined for heaven. He was destined for our Father below, as Screwtape says. And yet something happens decisively in chapter 13. And so from the devil's perspective, from Screwtape's perspective, this chapter is about the evils of the enemy when it comes to what I would call simple pleasures.
Yeah, simple pleasures.
Yeah.
So here's Wormwood allowing the patient to basically come back to reality, to enjoy life 2 times in a row.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's a renewal of the patient's life in reality, in God, and this noxious fume that, as Screwtape talks about, this life of grace, enters into this person's life at Wormwood's expense.
Yeah, if you didn't like God's presence, how would you describe? In the Bible, they talk about like the pillar of cloud, or and here he very
the same cloud
diabolically, kind of imaginatively says it's an asphyxiating cloud or a noxious fumes, right? And that's why he describes grace as I think of that cloud over line, the Peanuts character.
Oh, right. Yeah.
It's kind of like this dirt ball.
Yeah.
You see, grace is the devil's dirt ball.
Pigpen. That's
a pigpen. From the devil's perspective, God's grace is like pigpen, right? So it's this cloud, and so you've got something that is surprising, because you wouldn't think, first off, that our spiritual life can be at least jump-started or sparked by just simple pleasures in life.
Yeah.
What's the examples he gives? Remind me. He talks. There's something that are pretty kind of straightforward when it comes to our kind of daily living. 2
real positive pleasures.
Yeah.
So, just looking at the first page here, but
well, the first one has to do with reading a good book.
Yeah, reading a good book and
like
taking a nice
Letters.
walk.
Yeah.
And taking a nice walk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
he enjoyed life.
Yeah. So he sat down and just read a book.
Yeah.
A good book. Yeah. Out in the days of screens and things like that, just sitting and actually reading a book.
An actual book.
Exactly. Not just a printed out kind of thing. Reading again, actually having a book. No, reading a book, taking a walk. He talks about him taking this walk at this old mill, so you just kind of get the sense of being out in nature and how restorative that can be. I mean, I love to hike.
Exactly.
Hike around, so there's a sense in which there is something I find very, very restorative about just walking in a way where you just kind of like breathe in the fresh air, kind of getting out, just feeling, solidity under your feet, and you're not really, there's no reason other than to just breathe and think and let your reflections kind of go and just kind of enjoy that sense. So interesting that the devil wants to keep us from those simple pleasures. He wants to bombard us with stimulation rather than engage in kind of the simple pleasures of life. And that's our spirituality needs it. There's a healthy way of doing that. And so he talks about even the quote unquote evils of county cricket or collecting stamps or drinking cocoa, which means, and here, of course, I transpose county cricket into be, fondness for local sporting teams like the Warriors.
Yeah. Or watching golf.
Yeah.
On television.
Inside joke there.
Inside joke, sorry about that.
We're talking about, golf is not the most engaging. It's there's not many sporting events on these days, I know.
Not during the quarantine chronicles.
Not during quarantine chronicles. But
again, just be outdoors and having, what we were talking about last podcast, just having fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you don't feel like taking a walk, that could be a temptation.
Yeah.
So
get out there.
Interesting. Thomas Aquinas says, in fact, his correlative to this is where he talks about if you're feeling kind of that low kind of sense in life and sadness and things like that, you think he's going to, in that moment in the Summa, talk about, he does bring up spiritual kinds of principles of joy and stuff, but he says sometimes, a warm bath and a glass of wine, right? So and this is what C.S. Lewis is talking about right here. Yeah. He's talking about that sense in which we need to enjoy the simple pleasures of life in a very intentional way.
Right.
That's not just kind of stimulating or getting out, but it's just connecting with life again and the goodness of God's creation. It can be so powerful. And so if we don't want to take a walk, that could be a temptation. Next time you don't want to take a walk,
get outside.
There you go. Get outside.
Put on your sunglasses and go out.
To do that. Which brings us to chapter 14. And chapter 14 is a particularly subtle and I think subversive chapter. What's this one about?
Isn't this the weaponizing humility chapter?
Indeed it is, yeah.
Which is a strange concept in itself.
Yeah.
But it's very fun how you put it.
So just to give the narrative, so the Ants kind of hits a low point. Wormwood is able to kind of get him all the way to chapter 12, the graduate slope. He's headed downward. Then he enjoys some simple pleasures and realizes suddenly he hasn't been on the right way. He needs to kind of reboot. And so Wormwood is expressing in an unnamed letter that he has a little healthy dose of humility in his life. And Screwtape says, he's becoming humble? Okay, there's an app for that. There's a temptation for that. There's a temptation for that. He's humble, there's a temptation for that. And what is it? It's as I've been using the verb weaponize, and the adjective weaponizing humility. Well, turn his attention to the fact that he is humble. Yeah. Right?
Yeah. The minute you admit that you're humble is the minute that you're not. Right? So in a way.
It is one of those things. I think in a sense for myself, I think there's a way in which I'm no doubt brilliant and generous and most of all humble.
You are the most humble person that I have ever met.
No, the minute you in a sense name it or at least be puffed up by it or that's such a moment is the moment you're kind of violated.
Right.
There is a way in which humility can, and any of the virtues. St. Augustine here, as it goes beyond the particular text, but St. Augustine has a very powerful thing where he talks about that. Obviously, the antithesis of humility is pride. He says that at the end of the day, any virtue we do always has the ability to be twisted by pride. Yeah. In other words, any good thing you do, and it can be the most heroic action of love, if the devil can turn your attention to not just what you did, but that you did it, and therefore you must be so good and proud in the center of everything. Exactly. It can be twisted into a form of self-aggrandizement and pride. So he says pride is always the devil's temptation to twist the goodness that we do. And that goodness, there is no goodness that is not have at least the weakness from our human perspective that it could be transformed into a moment of pride. This is why pride is the original sin. Right. In that way. And so Screwtape is saying when as the demon you're despairing of temptation, turn the patient's attention to the fact that how humble he is. And therefore now all of a sudden you've got him right back where you want him, because once again, it's all about the I, the self, in a way. It's also, and once you think of that way, then you can also be a little bit judgmental towards others. You can see like, oh, that other person it's kind of the Pharisee, like, you know, like, oh, there's the publican in the back, and dear Lord, I'm going to pray.
Thank goodness I'm not him. Yeah.
Amen. Exactly. And and here's the thing: all the things the Pharisee mentions, I pay, I fast, I tithe, I fast, I do these great sacrifices, and how good am I? Right? Who's the holiest guy and has two thumbs?
This guy over here.
This guy.
Yeah.
Right? And so you've got that. But then he makes, and this is where he kind of turns that, so you think it's kind of headed down, that this temptation is just going to be like, turn his attention towards how good he is, focus on how humble he is, and that's it. But then he gives a kind of, this is from the diabolical perspective, of course, gives insight into what humility is not as well. So humility, and this is where that famous line, or at least it's where the famous line is taken, that humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking about yourself less.
Yeah.
Right? That's basically the upside of this chapter in terms of, and the idea is for the Screwtape that says, have the patient think less about themselves if you can't get him to think greater about himself.
Right.
Right? So he turns this on its head. It's back to that extremism.
Right.
So on the one hand,
right. Yeah.
So we just talked in length about how you can always tempt someone to pride, even if it's humility, by thinking, oh, I'm so humble.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you can get, on the other extreme, you can get a person to wallow in what we might call a false humility of saying, oh, I'm no good.
Yeah.
I'm worthless, no talent, no grace, no anything.
Yeah. I don't have any gifts whatsoever, etc. Yeah.
And to think less about themselves. And so he says, oh, the person is humble. Here's two ways you can go. Either induce them to pride or induce them to a false sense of humility.
Distort their definition of what humility is.
Exactly. And so this is where he has that definition, beautiful definition, I think, of humility as self-forgetfulness.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he says to the extent that someone is forgetful of themselves in the moment, then the enemy, i.e. God, has them, or is progressing by virtue, and this is what threatens us. And so there, and he even says to the point that he says it's even from this perspective that he said the enemy, God, would rather have someone think of themselves as a great architect, a great poet, and then forgot about it, than he should spend much time and pains to think of himself as a bad one. So in other words, when it comes to, and he brings this up later, when it comes to food and gluttony, he says gluttony, you think of overeating, but he says there's a way in which is undereating, or being very particular about how, so basically not using food well. When it comes to what we think about ourselves, pride and humility, there's a way in which we can think too much of ourselves, for sure, but there's a way we can think too less of ourselves. And he says the better way to go in the contemporary age is to get people to think too less of themselves. That's a more effective way. And I guess he's come from the perspective of, I guess, if you're a megalomaniac, if you think you're, unless you're a megalomaniac, at some point you're going to fail, and you're going to have life's going to trip you.
Yeah,
right?
Right.
Right? So ultimately, from the devil's perspective, pride can certainly cause us to fall, but when we fall, we humiliation exists.
Right.
And so the humiliation is always an occasion for humility to come to the forefront.
Right.
Better and more consistent from the devil's perspective to trap someone in the false aura of humility, quote unquote, by just thinking that they're no good, they're trash. Right? I can't tell you how often, and I had the Father Paul Scanlon, I don't know if you remember Father Paul.
Blessed memory.
Yeah, so he did almost every kind of ministry in the province, from being prior provincial, the head of the whole province, and at a time in our province that was
a crucial time.
Crucial, so beloved. But then also did missions work in Meghalli, and was in the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. I had the privilege and pleasure of being with him when I was in Benicia, and had to kind of take over there, and he was just so supportive and just really a wonderful holy man. But he often, I was asking him one day about preaching, and he said one of the most difficult truths of our faith that it's easy to say, but really hard for, I feel, people to understand, is to know how much God loves them, not because of what they do, but just because they're God. They've been created by God, and God, as he says, he loved the phrase, God doesn't make trash.
Yeah.
You said that over. That was we have our frequent kind of as preachers, your lines you go back to, that we might be the saint that we might be called to be.
Radiating joy of the gospel.
Radiating the joy of the gospel, exactly. Yeah. So we all know well of it.
Yeah.
His was God doesn't make trash.
Yeah.
That God has loved us into existence, and He's created us for love, and He loves us. We don't have to do it. We don't have to do more than that, in a sense.
Yeah.
I mean, we're called that. That call elicits a response from us.
Yeah.
We're not just complacent or indifferent to that. But the first point, the foundation of all things, is that we are lovable. We are loved, and we are lovable. We are capable of receiving love in every way, and of ultimately giving that love. But here's where the devil wants to tempt us to think we are not lovable.
That we are trash.
That we're trash.
Yeah.
That we fail, we fail reliably, and there's no way, given our understanding of human love, that anyone in their right mind could truly love us for who we are, because if they really got to know us,
they would run away. Yeah.
Yeah. Because we think that we would run away from
ourselves.
That's
we our own projection. Yeah.
Exactly. And so the devil says, this is a foundational, critical temptation that Screwtape says, you, Wormwood, this is your way in.
Yeah.
Like, if you want to really, the patient's making progress, he's beginning to turn a corner, hit him with false humility, hit him with a sense of, you know what, you're trash, you're no good, look at all these ways you failed.
Yeah.
That's diabolical, right? Because you don't usually think of that as a temptation.
Yeah.
Right? False humility. You think like, oh, it's not good, but I think we psychologize that in a way. We made it more. What is that word?
Psychologicalized.
Psychologicalized. I guess
leave
that
the real word in comments.
No, I think that's a word. I think I just found it.
Psychologicalized.
Yeah. There you go.
Okay. I don't even know how to spell it.
We've made it it's come into the domain of the psychological.
Okay.
When why use one word when 15 will do? That's chapter 14.
Are we doing brain scrabble?
Okay. That's more like, what are those phrase? More like never mind. Okay, chapter 14 with Weaponizing community. Last chapter for this podcast, chapter 15. Another insightful one about. How would you summarize this one? Give me the word.
Weaponizing time.
Time.
Yeah.
This is where he's time, and of course, when it comes to time, we've got past, present, and future, and then he brings in eternity. Yeah. And what's Screwtape's strategy here in this chapter? Would you say?
Well, he does an analysis of like what's of past, present, and future. What is the most real and present? And of course, the last thing that Wormwood would want is to have the patient actually be present in reality and thinking about the here and now, because that'll root him into reality and nature and all that such, which is the one thing he doesn't want to do. So what Screwtape suggests is that to have the patient and to focus basically on the future, to live a life of uncertainty and anxiety.
Yeah, and so once again, the context of this writing is the war, but once again, like in all these letters, easily transposed into pandemic sorts of things and political kinds of things in terms of our current moment here. And it was interesting, he goes, okay, here's the question. How should you face that sense of time when you're coming to temptation? And usually we think of eternity as being just kind of never-ending time. So eternal life is all about the future, right? That's eternal life. That's what I think. You naturally think of that. Here, C.S. Lewis, through Screwtape, makes an interesting point. He relates eternity more not with the future, but with the present. He says eternity is like the present.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Eternal life is the eternal now.
Right.
It's not the future. I mean, we will experience it in the future. Yeah. But God and all the saints, they're in the now.
Yeah. How we will experience it is that it's.
Yeah. Like right now, where it's such and such a clock on such and such a day, and we're in time. But right now, God is experiencing this moment. We're part of we're kind of like running out the string, not to get too in the weeds of the philosophy of time, but the changes in motion which mark the passing of our lives in this moment
right.
are subsumed by the reality of the ever-present now, which is eternity.
Right.
Right. So eternity is not a point on the end of the line of my particular lifespan. It's how I come into that present.
Right.
But it's not. How put it? All time is embraced by the one moment of God's now.
Right.
And C.S. Lewis does a very interesting way of connecting eternity with the present and distinguishing and saying, if you want to tempt, temptation is always towards the hypothetical out there.
Right.
The future, as you say, the future, not in the sense of eternity, but the future in the not ever real.
Yeah.
The fanciful.
Yeah.
Because the future as future is defined as that which is not yet.
Right.
And that which will never be, because for it to be would be participate in eternity.
Right.
Right. So I thought it was very clear. And then he does talk a little bit about the past and say there's some good temptation fodder in the past in terms of getting to feel
living in the past and all that such.
Yeah, getting trapped in the past. So guilt, shame. These are tried and true methods. So he does encourage them a little bit. He says, sometimes he says especially a widow or a scholar to live in the past.
Right.
And interesting, because what was C.S. Lewis ultimately?
He was a scholar, right? He was
and a widow.
Yeah.
Is what. So once again, even in these letters, as we call them at the very outset, it's somewhat there's some little autobiography there, little jabs.
A little bit of a reflection.
So he says, there are certain personalities and types that live in the past, and he makes it very clear that he himself is prone to living in the past, of being caught up in the past, and being paralyzed by the past. Right. But a more diabolical, a more pernicious temptation is not living in the past, but in worrying and being anxious for the future. And I would say the future is, how to put it, it can induce a sense of expectation that we never get to, but always keeps us perpetually unhappy.
Right, right.
Yeah, the moment we get something, we want something else, and that's just, it's always. And this goes back almost to the discouragement of the second letter, because he talks about getting the patient to be disillusioned and disappointed by the reality of the church, to love the theory of the church, the romanticized kind of. And this goes not just for church, but for any relationship. Right. Oh, we're in love. You see a couple. Oh, we're in love. We're dating. It's the honeymoon phase, if you will, right? But then disillusion comes in. This is a correlative for the philosophical passing of time in a way. The future is the romantic, right? We have a future, right? I mean, even think of, in terms of like when you're young, the future is just anything can be. Possibilities are endless.
Yeah.
We get to the
end. World is your oyster.
Exactly. At the end of our life, this is the time's up. It's just, kind of like I've lived it kind of thing. And it's the most important thing, and he calls back and again, as long as we are in the present and living in the present, that eternal now, then we can be in God's grace. Or from Screwtape Letters, then you're in trouble because you're able to connect with the enemy. The enemy is able to connect with you in that way. And so he says this is kind of that idea of what I was talking about in terms of the never actual. Screwtape says, Wormwood, we want a whole race of people perpetually in the pursuit of the end of the rainbow, right?
Yeah.
Never honest, never kind, never happy now, but always using the future as fuel to heap on an altar of the future where every gift will be offered to them. And when every gift is offered in the present, you miss the present gift because you're so focused on the future. So not only does the future never happen and never fulfill you, you miss the gift that's right in front of you.
Which is why it's called a present.
There you go. Exactly. So that's once again, I think a good stopping point for us today. So maybe to recap, what do we have? So 12 through 15, we had a kind of turning of the plot and the narrative in these letters, with the end of chapter 11 from last time being where there's a kind of a sense in every way that the patient was taking a turn downward, right? And then he's into overstimulated and these friends that have been weaponized. And so now the gentle slope, if you want to, I'd say if you want to summarize kind of like, this is almost in some ways a foundational chapter. Chapter 12 is almost you can start there. It's like that is the ultimate strategy of Satan. The gentle slope downward, and then the pivot point 13, it all, kind of turns on its head with, from the devil's perspective, the evils of the simple pleasures, right? And the necessary ways in which we need to connect with recreation and reality in a good book. And then the last two chapters, this time 14 and 15, being weaponizing humility, especially the inability to be someone who's lovable, or to think of yourself, to think less about yourself, where we just should think about ourselves less, not less of ourselves, right? And then finally the time, the weaponizing time, especially the future, being always future-oriented. Not that we don't make goals, but always be striving for the future in such a way that we are oblivious to the gifts of the present.
So thank you for joining part 3 of these analysis of Screwtape Letters. Join us next week for the next handful of chapters. So if you want to help out the Videocast and podcast, you know what to do. Share this link with your friends and neighbors. Review us. Say good things about us.
Very good. So may all that you do truly, to use that phrase we love so well, radiate the joy of the gospel in the heart of the city. Amen.
Amen.